Hey crew, it's Pitt, and I'm back with some more esoterica. Today we are diving back into the works of Carl Jung. This is Mysterium, Conjuntionis. We are reading aloud and discussing as we go along the various points brought to light by the text. It is not the format for everyone, but people do find value in it, so you are more than welcome to tag along as we continue our exploration. Before we begin, however, if you are unfamiliar with me, any of my unconventional beliefs, or if at any point in time I lose you in terminology, there will be several playlists linked in the box in the corner above, in the box down below, along with the original source material, the link for my book where I teach you to do all of these things in a much more efficient manner, and the links to get in contact with me directly or just to support the channel so that you can get a better understanding of who I am and why I say the things that I do. With that being said, we are going to dive in and continue our exploration of Mysterium Conjuntionis with Chapter 6, Part 8. I think it's Chapter 6. It might be Chapter 5. We're only like 3 sections away from the end, guys. We're almost there. Part 8. The content and meaning of the first 2 stages. I would like to impress on the reader that the following discussion, far from being a digression, is needed in order to bring a little clarity into what seems a very confused situation. I will point out, as I have all the way through this, that it is only confusing because he does not have the key that unlocks it. The key that unlocks it was revealed in Sulfur, which was Chapter 3, I believe. We talked about it quite extensively. There are things that he did not meet. Dorn did, right? We're going there next. It'll be almost certainly going to be the chemicum theatricum next. Jung was missing a key, and therefore it was confusing for him. That is something that we have talked about quite extensively. So this situation arose because, for the purpose of amplification, we commented on 3 symbolic texts ranging over a period of more than 500 years, namely those of Albertus Magnus, Gerald Dorn, and an anonymous author of the 18th century. We have not done the works of Magnus yet. I haven't really seen any reason to. We may on the other side of Dorn. We're going to the Theatrica Chemicum next because of Dorn. Dorn appears to know what he is talking about. I would like to get his viewpoint on things. We may wind up doing Albertus Magnus next if there is sufficient reason to. And I'm just pointing that out, right? That is something that we are going to do. I'm going to try not to stop as much in this one. It's like 14 pages long, which is probably close to 2 hours. So these 3 authors were concerned, each in his own way, with the central events and figures of the magistry. One could, of course, adduce yet other descriptions of the mysterious process of conjunction, but that would only make the confusion worse. Wrong, right? I feel like I have clarified, right? If you feel like I have clarified, if you have been following along and feel like maybe I have clarified some of this confusion, drop it in the box down below. Right? Again, he was missing a key. Go back to Sulfur, right? If any of this today is going to be confusing for you, I would recommend Sulfur. Right, the study that we are doing right now, Mysterium Conjuntionis, the Chapter 3, there was like 6 videos on Sulfur. They explain a lot of what we're going to be talking about, probably a lot better. For the purpose of disentangling the fine-spun web of alchemical fantasy, these 3 texts are sufficient. And again, this right here is exactly the key that he is missing. Right? He is looking at it through a lens, but it is not the correct lens. He is looking at it as though it is fantasy, and it is not. It is a reality. If Dorn then speaks of freeing the soul from the fetters of the body, he is expressing in rather different language what Albertus Magnus describes as the preparation or transformation of the quicksilver, or what our unknown author depicts as the splitting of the king in the yellow robe. Yes, all 3 of those are correct, and he is wrong in his interpretation of it. That is what's so wild, right? He is so very close, much like Nietzsche. Nietzsche got really close. He never crossed the line. Again, if you are confused, I have done the Thus Spake Zarathustra, and Nietzsche did not get there. The arcane substance is meant in all 3 cases. That is true. Sulfur. Hence, we immediately find ourselves in darkness. In the Negretto, for the arcanum, the mystery is dark, because it begins in the void. The void is dark. If, following Dorn's eliminating hints, we interpret the freeing of the soul from the fetters of the body as a withdrawal of the naive projections which we have molded both the reality around us and the image of our own character, we arrive, on the one hand, at cognito sui ipsius, self-knowledge, but on the other hand, at a realistic or less non-illusory view of the outside world. That is true, right? That is true, but it is only half of the equation. It is quite literally only half of what Dorn was talking about. And because he has the key that fits half the lock, he assumes that he has the whole lock. But he does not. He does not have the key for the other half of the lock. That is obvious from this study. He did not get it. He missed it. This stripping off the veils of illusion is felt as distressing and even painful, right? Because what this is talking about, right? This is the meditative process. This is the retreat into oneself. And it is talking about the exploration of the astral realms. It is talking about far-seeing. It is talking about divination. It is talking about the capacity to see what might happen in the future. Those things are real. Right? I know. I don't care what the scientists say, right? The scientists don't have the fucking key. And so that is real. And that is the part that he is missing, right? He is looking at it as though it is allegory when it is not. It is literal. It is something that is true. In practical treatment, this phase demands much patience and tact, for the unmasking of reality is, as a rule, not only difficult, but very often dangerous. That is true. There were a lot of warnings in my book. The illusions would not be so common if they did not serve some purpose and occasionally cover up a painful spot with a wholesome darkness, which one hopes will never be illuminated. Self-knowledge is not an isolated process. It is possible only if the reality of the world around us is recognized at the same time. That is emphatically true. Nobody can know himself and differentiate himself from his neighbor if he has a distorted picture of him, just as no one can understand his neighbor if he had no relationship to himself. The one conditions the other, and the two processes go hand in hand. I cannot describe the process of self-knowledge here in all its details, but if the reader wishes to form some idea of it, I would draw his attention to the wide variety of infantile assumptions and attachments which play a great role not only in psychopathology, but in so-called normal life, and which cause endless complications in every sphere of human existence. Yeah, there are a lot of them, too many to go into. We have talked about them going along the way. Freud's lasting achievement in this field suffers only from the defect that, from the insights gained, a theory was prematurely abstracted, which was then used as a criterion of self-knowledge. I would not say only, but that is definitely something that it suffered from, right? The assumption that everybody wants to have sex with one of their parents, or that it all goes back to a deep-driven sexual desire, was something that Freud did put out there, right? The need to place blame upon someone else is Freud's major problem, right? Someone else has to be responsible for the way that you're acting. There's no way that you can take responsibility for that. That, to me, is the main differentiation between Freudian psychology and Jungian psychology. Jung is about self-responsibility, about going into yourself, doing the self-reflection, and understanding where you are wrong. Freud is about investigating your life and seeing where everybody else is to blame in it. Right? That is victim mentality. That is going to be a hard no from me every single time that it is identified. Sometimes it is a little harder to identify than others. If you are placing your eternal salvation upon someone else, that is victim mentality. If you are living your life today for rewards in the afterlife, that is victim mentality. There is a lot of victim mentality that goes around. We could all use a lot more self-responsibility. Projections were recognized and corrected only so far as they were assumed to correspond to known infantile fantasies. That there are many other kinds of illusions is hardly mentioned at all in the literature, and for just that reason. As we have seen from Dorn, there are very many important things which are posited as self-evident and which do not exist, such as the alchemist's assumption that certain substances have magical qualities, which in fact are projections of fantasy. No, again, missing key. The missing key is they were using allegory, right? Now, he made that assumption, but he is assuming that they didn't make that assumption. They were using an allegory. We have unpacked the allegory quite extensively as we have gone through. This is something that he has incorrect. Did they do alchemy? Yes, right? Physical alchemy, right? With chemicals and stuff. They were trying to discover what they had already discovered within themselves. They had the misguided apprehension that there is a correlation all the time, as above, so below, right? That is true in a lot of ways, but it is also not true in some, right? One of those ways is that there is a philosopher's stone inside of yourself that you can find. You can unlock a lot of things with that philosopher's stone, but there's not one that is external. There is not one that can be created. But because they were able to create the internal one, by which they were able to make gold out of shitty situations and significant other things too. Magical works. I believe in magic. Right? But because of that, he is looking at it as if it is a projection of fantasy, but they just couched their language there. They were looking for something to be physical in the thing that they had already on the spiritual level. They were looking for that concurrence between the as above and the as below. Well, in this particular instance, there isn't one. There is no physical stone that you are going to create external from yourself that allows the transmutation of other things. If there is, we are a long way from discovering it, right? I don't like using never. I don't like using not at all. But sometimes it is appropriate, and this is probably one of those times. And so again, we have the key that he is missing. They knew that this was not something that they had achieved in the physical realm. They knew that it was a spiritual thing, but because their head would be separated from their body if they expressed that in clear terms, they had to express it in chemical terms. It was an allegory. It was something that if you had the key, you could unlock. They spread the key around, but they only did it to very select people. They formed clubs and groups, and that is how the knowledge was carried forth. This is, again, him just missing a key. He does not understand. He did not make the philosopher's stone himself. The progressive correction of these brings us, however, to a frontier which at first cannot be crossed. As a rule, it is set up by the spirit of the age with its specific conception of truth and by the state of scientific knowledge prevailing at the time. Self-knowledge is an adventure that carries us unexpectedly far and deep. Even a moderately comprehensive knowledge of the shadow can cause a good deal of confusion and mental darkness, since it gives rise to personality problems which one had never remotely imagined before. Yeah, right. Doing your shadow work will intrinsically change your personality. This is something that I am dealing with in my own life, right? Who I was 5 years ago is completely different than the person I am today. And you can witness that, right? You can go back and see the beginning videos, and who I am now and who I was then, not even close to the same. Who I was 5 years before that and who I am now might as well be on different worlds. Who I was prior to that, if you go back prior to the birth of my children and the way that I am now, you couldn't even conceive that it would be the same person. I am intrinsically, fundamentally changed. Like everything, my entire viewpoint is different. I don't look at the world in the same light at all, in the slightest way. Almost every single thing that I did assume, my ignorant assumptions, has been changed, right? And it does give rise to personality problems. If your personality has been set upon these beliefs that you have had for 20 years, and then all of a sudden that gets completely turned on its head, it causes some personality changes, right? I am different than who I used to be. I cannot hang out with the people that I did before. My acceptance for things has significantly changed. For this reason alone, we can, into its For this reason alone, we can into its former bondage, and everything would have been as before. There is a word missing here. The volatile essence, so carefully shut up and preserved in the hermetic vessel of the unio mentalis, could not be left to itself for a moment, because this elusive Mercurius would then escape and return to its former nature. I will point out very quickly that Mercurius is the Holy Spirit. It is both the positive and the negative. That will probably come up again. As according to the testimony of the alchemists, not infrequently happened. The direct and natural way would have been to give the soul its head, since we are told that it always inclines to the body. Being more attached to this than to the spirit, it would separate itself from the latter and slip back into its former unconsciousness without taking with it anything of the light of the spirit into the darkness of the body. For this reason, the reunion with the body was something of a problem. Psychologically, it would mean that the insight gained by the withdrawal of projections could not stand the clash with reality, and consequently, that its truth could not be realized in fact, and at least not to the desired degree or in the desired way. You can, as you know, forcibly apply the ideals you regard as right with an effort of will, and can do so for a certain length of time and up to a certain point, that is, until signs of fatigue appear and the original enthusiasm wanes. Then, free will becomes a cramp of the will, and the life that has been suppressed forces its way into the open through all the cracks. That, unfortunately, is the lot of all merely rational resolutions. Since earliest times, therefore, men have had recourse in such situations to artificial aids, ritual actions such as dances, sacrifices, identification with ancestral spirits, etc., in the obvious attempt to conjure up or reawaken those deeper layers of the psyche which the light of reason and the power of the will can never reach, and to bring them back to memory. For this purpose, they used mythological or archetypal ideas which express the unconscious. So it has remained to the present time, when the day of the believer begins and ends with prayer, that is, with a rite d'entrée et de sortie. I have one of these, right? No, I do begin and end my day every single day with a prayer. When I wake up, the first thing that comes out of me, right, thank you for this day. Right, good morning, Lord, thank you for this day, is the very first thing that I think about when I am intentionally thinking it all. And then it is, I am thankful for my wife and my children, for my home and my provision, for my crew and the mission, for the healing and the vision, for the abundance that I receive, and for the abundance that I give. Right? That is my daily. I begin and end my day with that. And at the end of the day, it begins with, thank you for this day. And so this is something that I do practice quite extensively in my life. And it's not just then, right? I try every single time I think about it to run through that. Right? I try to remain in the idea of thankfulness as much as possible. I give thanks for as much as I possibly can. This exercise fulfills its purpose pretty well. If it did not, it would have long since fallen into disuse. If ever it lost its efficacy to any great extent, it was always in individuals or social groups for whom the archetypal ideas have become ineffective. Though such ideas or representations collectives are always true insofar as they express the unconscious archetype, their verbal and pictorial form is greatly influenced by the spirit of the age. If this changes, whether by contact with understand why the alchemists call their negredo melancholia, a blacker than black night, an affliction of the soul, confusion, etc., or more pointedly, the black raven. Right now, negredo is the darkening. It is the beginning of the process. It is when you are in the void, and indeed, blacker than black is appropriate. For us, the raven seems a funny allegory, but for the medieval adept, it was, as we have said, a well-known allegory of the devil. 216. I did not pull that up. Hold on, let me get my number. 966. Let's go to page 966, and then we are on 216. The raven is a symbol of the devil in Paulinus of Aquileia, Liber Exhortationis. I will point out that the devil is not a physical entity. There is no co-equal to God tempting you to sin. See the Bible study. Correctly assessing the psychic danger in which he stood, it was therefore of the utmost importance for him to have a favorable familiar as a helper in his work, and at the same time to devote himself diligently to the spiritual exercise of prayer. All this in order to meet effectively the consequences of the collision between his consciousness and the darkness of the shadow. Even for modern psychology, the confrontation with the shadow is not a harmless affair, and for this reason it is often circumvented with cunning and caution. Rather than face one's own darkness, one contents oneself with the illusion of one's civic rectitude. Certainly, most of the alchemists handled their negretto and the retort without knowing what it was they were dealing with. But it is equally certain that adepts like Marinius, Dorn, Michael Meyer, and others knew in their way what they were doing. At least one of them, right? Marinius, I am not sure about. We have seen several referrals to Meyer, and I don't have any disagreements that I remember with him. But Dorn absolutely was on to something. And it's funny because he says others knew in their way, right? Well, Dorn knew better than you. Dorn had a better idea than you did what was going on. It was this knowledge, and not their greed for gold, that kept them from laboring at the apparently hopeless opus. It was not hopeless. Dorn, at least, actually achieved the goal, for which they sacrificed their money, their goods, and their life. Their spirit was, in their own belief in the light, a spirit which drew the soul to itself from its imprisonment in the body. This imprisonment in the body is victim mentality. It is one of the essential victim mentalities that humanity has, that this is a prison planet, that you are condemned to punishment if you do not take one very specific course of action, even if you are never exposed to that very specific course of action. All of that is victim mentality entirely. And putting off onto something else that which is your responsibility. Saying that you are imprisoned in the body is not taking responsibility for your life in the body. It is not taking responsibility for your responsibilities that you have while in the body. It is putting off till tomorrow something that you should be doing today, or blaming someone else for something that you should be taking responsibility for. And so every single time that you see anybody talking about this term, or a prison planet, or that you're being fed, well, you are being fed off of by entities, but it is not an intrinsic thing. It is something that you do, right? I am feeding good entities these days. Most people are not. You get to choose. And so if this is what is being said, it is victim mentality. They almost certainly do not know what they are talking about at all. But the soul brought with it the darkness of the chthonic spirit, the unconscious. Sea sulfur. The separation was so important because the dark deeds of the soul had to be checked. The soul does the light deeds too. Right? It's not just dark deeds that the soul does. It's not just the dark decisions that the soul makes. The soul also makes good decisions. Right? Part of that prison planet mentality is, well, people suffer while they're here, so therefore this is a punishment, which is fucking retarded. Like, that is the stupidest shit, right? Because obviously everything in life is entirely detrimental, right? There's no good. There's no joy. There's no happiness. There's no excitement. There's no exaltation. There's none of that, right? It is all bad, depressive, terrible things, right? You're being tortured the entire time you're here. It really is a pitiful existence, right? There's no love. There's no happiness. No, you're just focusing on the wrong thing, right? If your soul is making the dark choices, then you're probably aligned in the wrong way. That you probably have some self-reflection to do. But that is not because your soul is intrinsically evil. It is simply because of the things that you were raised to accept as being okay. The unio mentalis signified, therefore, an extension of consciousness, and the governance of the soul's motions by the spirit of truth. But since the soul made the body to live and was the principle of all realization, The philosophers could not but see that after the separation of the body and the world, and its world were dead. Since the soul made the body to live, that is only partly true, and was the principle of all realization. That is not even true. The philosophers could not see, well, again, partly true, I guess, right? The soul does not make your body live. That is the spirit. The spirit is the part that makes your heart beat. It is the part that keeps you breathing when you are asleep. It is the part that changes your food into fuel. It is the part that allows that fuel to power your body. It is the part that makes that power move. That is the spirit, not the soul. The soul is the part that makes the choices. Your soul says, hey, do this thing, right? That is what your soul says. Now, it receives its information, right? Your soul, your consciousness is on this end of the pen. The unconscious is on this end. This end, that is the spirit. That is your connection with God. That is the oversoul, the God who is. Right now, you hear two voices on this end. You hear a positive one and a negative one. And which one you listen to is the one that you feed. We were just talking about feeding things. You begin with consciousness and you don't have a lot of it. Most of your actions are unconscious. But through positive reflection and the things that we talk about in here, you can take this and move that slider down this way. Now, you never fully achieve this. But this is the soul. This is the unconscious. And you hear these voices. These voices say, hey, you should do this. Or, hey, you should not do this. This voice hears these voices and then makes a decision. Hey, I'm going to do this thing. It's not you should. It is I'm going to. You decide to do something. That is your soul making the decision. But when you make the decision to wiggle your fingers, it is not you that makes it happen. It is the Holy Spirit, the power of God. That is what makes it happen. It is an electrical discharge that runs through your body at the will of the Spirit that makes your fingers wiggle. It is not you actually making it happen. You don't decide to breathe. You don't decide to make your heart beat. You don't decide to continue existing most of the time. And so this is wrong, right? Again, see sulfur. Sulfur is the spirit. Spirit is the part that makes the body live. And it is the principle of realization. The logos, the spirit, is quite literally change happening. Every single instance of heat, light, motion, thought, everything that is change is the logos. It is the spirit in motion. And so while you are making the decisions, you do not carry them out. And so you may decide, hey, I want to realize this thing, and then the spirit makes it happen. So in part, you do, right? It is the soul in part, but it is mostly the spirit. And so this is not quite correct. But again, that is the key that he is missing. And so, footnote 217. It is well known that the soul, before it was mingled with its body, was dead, and its body likewise. How is that known? How is that known? How is it known that the soul was dead before it was here? Where is your source material? Was it for that? Was you there? Well, if you were there, then you weren't dead, right? Right? Okay, so if you were there and you are the authority, then you weren't dead. And if you weren't there, you don't know. Nobody was there at the creation. That is one of the things that I stand upon. Nobody was there to literally write down, oh, this is the exact order in which things happen in the exact timing. That did not happen. Nobody was there for a few thousand years with any type of writing at all in the best light possible. And so there are a lot of things that are claimed to be known that are not known. This is one of them. Now, I firmly and fully stand upon that the soul is eternal, that it came from source and then it returns to source. I could be wrong. If I am wrong, it's not going to make a lot of difference to me. If I am right, it's going to make a lot of difference to you. And so, well, this is just completely useless. I don't know who this came from, but completely useless. This is some Agrippa type of shit. They therefore called this state of the grave corruption, mortification, and so on, and the problem then arose of reanimation, that is, of reuniting the soul with the inanimate body. Had they brought about this reanimation in a direct way, the soul would have simply have snapped back of foreign and possibly more advanced civilization, and or through an expansion of consciousness brought about by new discoveries and new knowledge, then the rite loses its meaning and degenerates into mere superstition. Examples of this on a grand scale are the extinction of the ancient Egyptian civilization and the dying out of the gods of Greece and Rome. A similar phenomenon can be observed in China today. The demand that arises under such conditions is for a new interpretation, in accord with the spirit of the age, of the archetypes that compensate for altered situation of consciousness. Christianity, for instance, was a new and more suitable formulation of the archetypal myth, which in turn gave the rite its vitality. See the Bible study. The archetype is a living idea that constantly produces new interpretations through which that idea unfolds. This was correctly recognized by Cardinal Newman in regard to Christianity. Footnote 218. Essay on the Development of Christian Doctrine. That probably has something to do with the fact that Christianity has assimilated from the pagans pretty much all of their rites. Right? Easter, that is the celebration of Ishtar. There is no reason for a rabbit and a bunny, or a rabbit and an egg, to be part of the springtime situation for Christ. There is no part of that that is even relevant to the story. The same is true with the Christmas tree, right? The Christmas tree comes directly from pagan things. There are a lot of the ceremonies that is taken directly, like no alteration from the pagan stuff. And so that's probably what this was talking about. The need, right? You go in with the sword and say, hey, you're part of my religion now. That's what happened. And then you're like, but we're going to let you keep this part, right? You get to keep your eggs in the springtime. You get to keep your bunnies bringing you eggs in the springtime. I mean, Easter, Ishtar, same word. Christian doctrine is a new interpretation and development of its earlier stages, as we can see very clearly from the ancient tradition of the God-man. There is a tradition of that. This tradition is continued in the unfolding of ecclesiastical dogma, and it is naturally not only the archetypes mentioned in the canonical writings of the New Testament that develop, but also their near relatives, of which we previously knew only the pagan forerunners. You still do only know that. An example of this is the newest dogma concerning the Virgin. It refers, unquestionably, to the mother goddess who was constantly associated with the young dying son. She is not even purely pagan, since she was very distinctly prefigured in the Sophia of the Old Testament. That is not true. That is simply and fundamentally not true. There is no prophecy of a virgin birth contained in Isaiah. See Isaiah. I have read it for you. For this reason, the definition of the new dogma does not really go beyond the depositium fidei. As a matter of fact, the virgin birth, the resurrection, that whole story comes from pagans. The definition of the new dogma does not really go beyond the depositium fidei, for the mother goddess is naturally implied in the archetype of the divine son and accordingly underwent a consistent development in the course of the centuries. Footnote 219. Declaration of the Virgin's right to the title of Theotokos, God-bearer, at the Council of Ephesus in 431. And definition of the Immaculate Conception by Pope Pius in 1854. There's a good current reference for it, right? This one was bad enough. 431 years later, we're going to set the doctrine, right? That obviously didn't change at all in 4 centuries. But then you go up to 18 centuries. So, wow. The depositum fidei corresponds in empirical reality to the treasure house of the archetypes, the gazophalacium of the alchemist, and the collective unconscious of modern psychology. The objection raised by theologians that the final state of the dogma in any such development would be necessarily more complete or perfect than in the apostolic era is untenable. That I agree with, right? What that is saying is that that the final state of development would be more complete or perfect than in the time of the people who actually studied at the source material, right? One of the contentions that I have with the New Testament, right? Paul has exactly the same experience with Jesus that I do. He has a religious experience by which an entity revealed itself to him. Now, that entity called itself Jesus, but there are entities that can lie. That's in the Bible. And that entity struck him. First, it told him, don't be afraid. That is a key signifier for a lot of things, mainly negative. And then he struck him with an affliction that only this one person, who was whatever, could take away, right? That was the entire extent of his experience. He was in direct contention, right? Directly oppositional to every single apostle that actually studied at the feet of Jesus. Directly oppositional. They were in contention over the execution of the doctrine of this new religion that they are forming from scratch. That is evident from the text itself. If you read through, when it talks about some other apostle, it is talking about Paul. When they're talking about don't listen to that apostle, that is Peter talking about Paul. And yet, fully half of the New Testament is Paul. That is a problem, right? He never once studied at the feet of Jesus. Not a single time did he receive the direct doctrine from the lips of the person. These other 11 people did. He was in direct contention with all 11 of these other people who studied at the feet of the Master. That is a big, big problem, and one that Christianity absolutely refuses to face. Obviously, the later interpretation and formulation of the archetype will be much more differentiated than in the beginning. A glance at the history of dogma is sufficient to confirm this. Yes, one has only to think of the Trinity, for which there is no direct evidence in the canonical writings. Yeah, right? John was wrong, right? Before, in the beginning, there was the Word, and the Word was with God, and God. None of that is true, right? None of that was a person. It was true, right? Before the beginning, there was God, and God was infinite and without form, the void. God decided to become the creation, and so he limited himself into the creation, becoming the Spirit. Going from the infinite into the finite, he is still infinite, but he has limited himself. That moment of change, everything created but not yet combining, that is the beginning. That is the moment of stasis. And then God spoke and said, I am the light, and became the light, and it was good, right? That sequence of events is the Logos. That changing of the stasis into motion, the combination of the elements, the accretion of the solar systems, all of that is the Logos. It has never been a single person, ever. That is a completely wrong interpretation of it. Completely. 100% wrong. And so it is a problem, right? That is the only reference to the Trinity, right? The Father, the Son, and the Spirit, which is not a good appellation. There's the Father, the Mother, and the Son. That's a good one. The Son being the Spirit. That's fine. But that is still anthropomorphizing all of the concepts. And there is no real reason to do that. You do not know what shape God's in, right? He created all of creation. And therefore, any of it could be a representative of him. It doesn't necessarily have to be humanity. In fact, it probably isn't. All right. But it does not follow from this. And again, I have talked extensively about this. I have an entire video that is this. It is the first real chapter in this, chapter 1, the Divine and the Trinity Explained. That has been linked as the standalone video for this entire study for a reason. But it does not follow from this that the primitive Christians had a less complete knowledge of the fundamental truths. Such an assumption borders on pernicious intellectualism, for what counts in religious experience is not how explicitly an archetype can be formulated, but how much I am gripped by it. The least important thing is what I think about. Footnote 220. See 1 Corinthians 13:12. Now I know in part, but then I shall know even as I am known. I wonder who wrote that. I know I step on toes. I do not apologize for it. The living idea is always perfect and always numinous. Human formulation adds nothing and takes away nothing, for the archetype is autonomous, and the only question is whether a man is gripped by it or not. If he can formulate it, more or less, then he can more easily integrate it with his consciousness, talk about it more reasonably, and explain its meaning a bit more rationally. But he does not possess it more, or in a more perfect way, than the man who cannot formulate his possession. Intellectual formulation becomes important only when the memory of the original experience threatens to disappear, or when its irrationality seems inapprehensible by consciousness. This is an auxiliary only, not an essential. Christianity, to return to our previous argument, was a unio mentalis in the overcoming of the body. In just this respect, the rite fulfilled its purpose, so far as that is possible for fallible human beings. Ancient man's sensuous delight in the body and in nature did not disappear in the process. You can say that again. But found free play in the long list of sins which has never at any time diminished in scope. There is an ever-increasing amount of things that humans self-limit from, even when there is no real reason to. His knowledge of nature, however, presents a special problem. Ever since antiquity, it had flourished only in secret and among the few, but it handed down certain basic conceptions through the centuries and, in the later Middle Ages, fertilized man's reawakened interest in natural bodies. Had the alchemists not had at least a secret premonition that their Christian unio mentalis had not yet realized the union with the world of the body, their almost mystical thirst for knowledge would scarcely be explicable. Yeah, it absolutely did not, and it absolutely cannot. Right? It is not possible for you to achieve this through this. Like you can get to a working degree, right? You can have the faith in this particular religion, and you'll be all right. Right, if you follow the teaching correctly, right? If you aren't going back to the Old Testament and trying to reenact those laws, you might be all right. There are several along the way that are going to be stumbling blocks, right? This is one of those things that steps on toes. Giving away all that you own, that is not good. It's really not. That is for an exceedingly small portion of the population. Abstaining from sex, same thing. Not good, right? I know that the book tells you different. The book is wrong. There are several things that the book is wrong about. That is part of it. There is a balance to be stricken between the virtues and the vices. God made you with genitalia to use them. He gave us alcohol to drink it. Right? Now that doesn't mean go and get pissed drunk or throw your genitals at everyone. Right? It is for specific purposes. You should be in sacred union with a single person to create life. That is part of your purpose here. The alcohol should be consumed in moderation, as an enjoyment factor, even in safety. That is fine. If you have problems with control, that is something that you need to work on. If you follow the teachings of Christ, the parts that are written in red, you're probably going to be all right. But there are those things that are not. The other thing, when you are bringing yourself into balance through the conscious knowledge that you are responsible for it, then you can achieve the unio mentalis. You can literally change your mental state into one of unification. That is a possibility. You come to the understanding of the appropriate use of the virtues and the vices. That is part of it. That is intrinsically missing from the religions. Had not yet realized their union with the world of the body, their almost mystical thirst for knowledge would scarcely be explicable, let alone the symbolism rivaling that of Christianity. Christianity assumed their symbolism, which began to develop already at the end of the 13th century. The Christ-Lapisse parallel shows more clearly than anything else that the world of natural bodies laid claim to equality and hence to realization in the second stage of the conjunctio. This raised the question of the way in which the conjunctio would be affected. Dorn answered this by proposing, instead of an overcoming of the body, the typical alchemical process of the separatio, solutio, incineratio, sublimatio, etc., of the red and white wine, the purpose of this procedure being to produce a physical equivalent of the substantia coelestis, recognized by the Spirit as the truth and as the image of God innate in man. That is, indeed, the end product. Whatever names the alchemists gave to the mysterious substance they sought to produce, it was always a celestial substance. An example, something transcendental, which, in contrast to the perishability of all known matter, was incorruptible, inert as a metal or stone, and yet alive, like an organic being, and at the same time a universal medicament. Such a body was quite obviously not to be met with in experience. The tenacity with which the adepts pursued the goal for at least 1700 years can only be explained by the numinosity of this idea. And we do indeed find, even in the ancient alchemy of Zosimos, clear indications of the archetype of the anthropos. 221. See the chicken yin of Wai Po Yang. As I have shown in Psychology and Alchemy, an image that pervades the whole of alchemy down to the figure of the homunculus in Faust. The idea of the anthropos springs from the notion of an original state of universal animation, for which reason the old masters reinterpreted their Mercurius as the anima mundi, and just as the original animation could be found in all matter, so too could the anima mundi. The anima mundi is the part that makes you move, right? Animating the body, anima mundi. That is the spirit, as I explained earlier. It is indeed Mercurius, because Mercurius is both the positive and the negative. It is the spirit in totality, as I explained earlier. It was imprinted on all bodies as their raison d'être, as an image of the demiurge who incarnated in his own creation and got caught in it. This, right here, is that self-same victim mentality that we were talking about before. This is the same as a prison, right? God is imprisoned in your soul. Nothing was easier to identify this anima mundi with the biblical imago Dei, the image of God, which represented the truth revealed to the spirit. For the early thinkers, the soul was by no means a merely intellectual concept. It was visualized sensuously as a breath body or a volatile but physical substance, which, it was readily supposed, could be chemically extracted and fixed by means of a suitable procedure. Right? That was the problem with the as above, as below that we talked about before. Visualized sensuously as a breath body or a volatile physical substance, sulfur, for instance. That is exactly correct. Now, that is not correct for the soul, but it is for the spirit. We have an intrinsic flipping, interposing of that is not understood by the author. This intention was served by the preparation of the phlegma vini. As I pointed out earlier, this was not the spirit and water of the wine, but its solid residue, the chthonic and corporeal part, which would not ordinarily be regarded as the essential and valuable thing about the wine. What the alchemist sought then, to help him out of his dilemma, was a chemical operation, which we today would describe as a symbol. The procedure he followed was obviously an allegory of his postulated substantia coelestis and its chemical equivalent. To that extent, the operation was not symbolical for him, but purposive and rational. For us, we know that no amount of incineration, sublimation, and centrifuging of the vinous residue can ever produce an air-colored quintessence. The entire procedure is fantastic if taken literally. That's because it is an allegory. We have discussed that. Again, see sulfur. We can hardly suppose that Dorn either meant a real wine, but after the manner of the alchemist, venum ardens, acetum, spiritualis sanguis, etc. In other words, Mercurius non vulgi, who embodied the anima mundi. Just as the air encompasses the earth, so in the old view the soul is wrapped around the world. As I have shown, we can most easily equate the concept of Mercurius with that of the unconscious. If we add this term to the recipe, it would run: take the unconscious in one of its handiest forms, say a spontaneous fantasy, a dream, an irrational mood, an affect, or something of the kind, and operate with it. Give it your special attention, concentrate on it, and observe its alterations objectively. Spare no effort to devote yourself to the task. Follow the subsequent transformations of the spontaneous fantasy attentively and carefully. Above all, don't let anything from outside that does not belong get into it, for the fantasy image has everything that it needs. That is mostly true, right? That is going through therapy, right? That is playing out fantastical things so that you can get to the subconscious mind. 222. Omni quo indiget is frequently said of the lapis. In this way, one is certain of not interfering by conscious caprice and of giving the unconscious a free hand. In short, the alchemical operation seems to us the equivalent of the psychological process of active imagination. Ordinarily, the only thing people know about psychotherapy is that it consists in a certain technique which the analyst applies to his patient. Specialists know how far they can get with it. One can use it to cure the neuroses and even the milder psychoses, so that nothing more remains of the illness except a general human problem of how much of yourself you want to forget, how much psychic discomfort you have to take on your shoulders, how much you may forbid or allow yourself, how much or how little you may expect of others, how far you should give up the meaning of your life, or what sort of meaning you should give it. The analyst has a right to shut his door when a neurosis no longer produces any clinical symptoms and has debouched into the sphere of general human problems. The less he knows about these, the greater his chances are of coming across comparatively reasonable patients who can be weaned from the transference that regularly sets in. But if the patient has even the remotest suspicion that the analyst thinks rather more about these problems than he says, then he will not give up the transference all that quickly, but will cling to it in defiance of all reason, which is not so unreasonable after all, indeed quite understandable. Even adult persons often have no idea how to cope with the problem of living, and on top of that are so unconscious in this regard that they succumb in the most uncritical way to the slightest possibility of finding some kind of answer or certainty. Were this not so, the numerous sects and isms would have long since have died out. But thanks to unconscious infantile attachments, boundless uncertainty, and lack of self-reliance, this one more than all the rest, they all flourish like weeds. I agree. The analyst, who is himself struggling for all those things which he seeks to inculcate into his patients, will not get round the problem of transference so easily. The more he knows how difficult it is for him to solve the problems of his own life, the less he can overlook the fear and uncertainty, or the frivolity and dangerously uncritical attitude of his patients. Even Freud regarded the transference as a neurosis at second hand and treated it as such. He could not simply shut the door, but honestly tried to analyze the transference away. This is not so simple as it sounds when technically formulated. Practice often turns out to be rather different from theory. You want, of course, to put the whole man on his feet and not just a part of him. You soon discover that there is nothing for him to stand on and nothing for him to hold on to. Return to the parents has become impossible, so he hangs on to the analyst. He can go neither backwards nor forwards, for he sees nothing before him that could give him a hold. All so-called reasonable possibilities have been tried out and have proved useless. Not a few patients then remember the faith in which they were brought up, and some find their way back to it, but not all. They know, perhaps, what their faith ought to mean to them, but they have found to their cost how little can be achieved with will and good intentions if the unconscious does not lend a hand. In order to secure its cooperation, the religions have long turned to myths for help, Or rather, the myths always flung out bridges between the helpless consciousness and the effective ideas forcées of the unconscious. If you cannot artificially and with an effort of will believe the statements of myth, if you have not previously been gripped by them, if you are honest, you will doubt the truth of the myths because our present-day consciousness has no means of understanding it. Historical and scientific criteria do not lend themselves to a recognition of mythological truth. It can be grasped only by the intuitions of faith or by psychology, and in the latter case, although there may be insight, it remains ineffective unless it is backed by experience. Thus, the modern man cannot even bring about the unio mentalis, which would enable him to accomplish the second degree of conjunction. And that's not that you can't. It just takes a little bit more, right? I do have outlined the way, a way, maybe not the way, but a way for sure. The analyst's guidance in helping him to understand the statements of his unconscious in dreams, etc., may provide the necessary insight, but when it comes to the question of real experience, the analyst can no longer help him. He himself must put his hand to the work. There's that self-responsibility we were talking about. He is then in the position of an alchemist apprentice who is inducted into the teaching by the master and learns all the tricks of the laboratory. But sometime he must set about the opus himself, for, as the alchemists emphasize, nobody else can do it for him. Like this apprentice, the modern man begins with an unseemly prima materia which presents itself in unexpected form. A contemptible fantasy, like the stone which the builders rejected, is flung into the street, and is so cheap that people do not even look at it. He will observe it from day to day and note its alterations until his eyes are opened, or, as the alchemists say, until the fish's eyes, or the sparks, shine in the dark solution, until the light penetrates the void. For the eyes of the fish are always open, and therefore must always see, which is why the alchemists used them as a symbol of perpetual attention. The light that gradually dawns on him consists in his understanding that his fantasy is a real psychic process which is happening to him personally. Although, to a certain extent, he looks on from outside, impartially, he is also an acting and suffering figure in the drama of the psyche. This recognition is absolutely necessary and marks an important advance. So long as he simply looks at the pictures, he is like the foolish Parsifal, who forgot to ask the vital question because he was not aware of his own participation in the action. Then, if the flow of images ceases, next to nothing has happened, even though the process is repeated 1,000 times. But, if you recognize your own involvement, you yourself must enter into the process with your personal reactions, just as if you were one of the fantasy figures, or rather, as if the drama being enacted before your eyes was real. It is a psychic fact that this fantasy is happening, and it is as real as you, as a psychic entity, are real. If this crucial operation is not carried out, all the changes are left to the flow of images, and you yourself remain unchanged. As Dorn says, you will never make the one unless you become one yourself. Let's go, Dorn, yet again. It is, however, possible that if you have a dramatic fantasy, you will enter the interior world of images as a fictitious personality, and thereby prevent any real participation. It may even endanger consciousness, because then you become the victim of your own fantasy, and succumb to the powers of the unconscious, whose dangers the analyst knows all too well. But if you place yourself in the drama as you really are, not only does it gain in actuality, but you also create, by your criticism of the fantasy, an effective counterbalance to its tendency to get out of hand. For what is now happening is the decisive reapproachment with the unconscious. This is where insight, the unio mentalis, begins to become real. What you are now creating is the beginning of individuation, whose immediate goal is the experience and production of the symbol of totality. It not infrequently happens that the patient simply continues to observe his images without considering what they mean to him. He can, and he should, understand their meaning, but this is of practical value only so long as he is not sufficiently convinced that the unconscious can give him valuable insights. But once he has recognized this fact, he should also know that he has then in his hands an opportunity to win by his knowledge independence of the analyst. This conclusion is one which he does not like to draw, with the result that he frequently stops short at the mere observation of his images. The analyst, if he has not tried out the procedure on himself, cannot help him over this style, assuming, of course, that there are compelling reasons why the procedure should be continued. In these cases, there is no medical or ethical imperative, but only a command of fate, which is why patients who by no means lack the necessary acumen often come to a standstill at this point. As this experience is not uncommon, I can only conclude that the transition from a merely perceptive, in example, ascetic, attitude to one of judgment is far from easy. Yeah, going from a J to a P, that's going to be hard, all right, or from a P to a J. And see the MBTI playlist. Indeed, modern psychotherapy has just reached this point and is beginning to recognize the usefulness of perceiving and giving shape to the images, whether by pencil and brush or by modeling. A musical configuration might also be possible, provided that it were really composed and written down. Though I have never met a case of this kind, Bach's Art of the Fugue would seem to offer an example, just as the representation of the archetypes is a basic feature of Wagner's music. These phenomena, however, arise less from personal necessity than from the unconscious compensations produced by the zeitgeist, though I cannot discuss this here. The step beyond a merely aesthetic attitude may be unfamiliar to most of my readers. I myself have said little about it and have contented myself with hints. Footnote 223, the transcendent function. Right. That is something, right, that is going beyond the appearances, that is diving into the actuality. That is going to be what I talk about. Right. It is not a matter that can be taken lightly. I tried it out on myself and others 30 years ago and must admit that although it is feasible and leads to satisfactory results, it is also very difficult. It can be recommended without misgivings if a patient has reached the stage of knowledge described above. If he finds the tasks too difficult, he will usually fail right at the beginning and never get through the dangerous impasse. The danger inherent in analysis is that, in a psychopathically disposed patient, it will unlock a psychosis. This very unpleasant possibility generally presents itself at the beginning of the treatment, when, for instance, dream analysis has activated the unconscious. But if it has got so far that the patient can do active imagination and shape out his fantasies, and there are no suspicious incidents, then there is, as a rule, no longer any serious danger. One naturally asks oneself what fear, if fear it is, prevents him from taking the next step, the transition to an attitude of judgment. The judgment, of course, should be morally and intellectually binding. I will point out that there is a fundamental... The way that people think is fundamentally different, right? The way that I think and the way that you think may be the same if we are the same type, but if you are not, we are going to look at things in a different way. I look at information as what is the most important idea, right? That is how I look at information. Other people look at information as what is the new idea? And some people, what is the most important thing? And other people, what is the new thing, right? That is four fundamentally different ways of looking at the exact same information. If we talk about there's a shiny new red car, right? Someone is going to say, or you ask four different people, what is the most important part of that statement? Somebody is going to say it's a new car. Somebody is going to say it's a red car. Somebody is going to say that it is shiny. And somebody is going to say something completely off the wall, right? It is four different ways of looking at the exact same thing. Fully half and half, fully split in half, is judgment and perceiving. Perceiving is looking for the new. Judging is sorting through the old. And so this is a step, right? If you are predisposed for finding new things, developing the capacity to judge those things is something that you have to create within yourself. If your focus is on judging those things, deciding which one is the best, then finding the new things, perceiving them, is going to be hard for you, right? One of the main reasons, I've got 2 chapters in this book that is developed to these concepts. Understanding these fundamental differences in the way that people think, the way that you think in particular, leads to the unlocking, in my experience, for all of the things that he is missing here. Back to the text. There are sufficient reasons for fear and uncertainty because voluntary participation in the fantasy is alarming to the naive mind and amounts to anticipated psychosis. Naturally, there is an enormous difference between an anticipated psychosis and a real one, but the difference is not always clearly perceived, and this gives rise to uncertainty and even a fit of panic. Unlike a real psychosis, which comes on you and inundates you with uncontrollable fantasies erupting from the unconscious, the judging attitude implies a voluntary involvement in those fantasy processes which compensate the individual and, in particular, the collective situation of consciousness. The avowed purpose of this involvement is to integrate the statements of the unconscious, to assimilate their compensatory content, and thereby produce a whole meaning, which alone makes life worth living. And for not a few people, possible at all. The reason why the involvement looks very like a psychosis is that the patient is integrating the same fantasy material to which the insane person falls victim, because he cannot integrate it, but is swallowed up by it. In myths, the hero is the one who conquers the dragon, not the one who is devoured by it, and yet both have to deal with the same dragon. Also, he is no hero who never met the dragon, or who, if once he saw it, declared afterwards that he saw nothing. Equally, only one who has risked the fight with the dragon and is not overcome by it wins the hoard, the treasure hard to attain. He alone has a genuine claim to self-confidence, for he has faced the dark ground of his self and thereby has gained himself. This experience gives him faith and trust, the pistis, in the ability of the self to sustain him. For everything that menaced him from inside he has made his own. He has acquired the right to believe that he will be able to overcome all future threats by the same means. He has arrived at an inner certainty which makes him capable of self-reliance and attained what the alchemist called the unio mentalis. As a rule, this state is represented pictorially by a mandala. Often, such drawings contain clear allusions to the sky and the stars and therefore refer to something like the inner heaven, the firmament, or Olympus of Paracelsus, the microcosm. This, too, is that circular product, the calum. Right? Now, I will point out once again that when you get to a certain point in this process, you will see mandalas. It will be inside you, right? The firmament, that's inside of you. 224. Concerning mandala symbolism and commentary and the blue center of Indian mandalas. The calum, which Dorn wanted to produce by assiduous rotary movements. Yeah, buddy, there are some assiduous rotary movements that are intrinsic to this process, clockwise and counter, because it is not very likely that he himself manufactured this quintessence as a chemical body, and he himself nowhere asserts that he did. One must ask whether he really meant this chemical operation, or rather, perhaps, the opus alchemicum in general, that is, the transmutation of the mercurius duplex under the synonym of the red and white wine. 225, and again I will refer you to sulfur. 225, red equals the sun and white equals the moon are the alchemical colors. Thus alluding to at the same time to the opus ad rubium et ad album. This seems to me more probable, I agree. At any rate, some kind of laboratory work was meant. In this way, Dorn shaped out his intuition of a mysterious center pre-existent in man, which at the same time represented a cosmos, in example, a totality, while he himself remained conscious that he was portraying the self in matter. He completed the image of wholeness by the admixture of honey, magic herbs, and human blood, or their meaningful equivalents, just as a modern man does when he associates numerous symbolic attributes with his drawing of a mandala. Also, following the old Sabaean and Alexandrian models, Dorn drew the influence of the planets, or Tartarus, and the mythological aspect of the underworld into its quintessence, just as the patient does today. 226. See a study in the process of individuation. Picture 9. In this wise, Dorn solved the problem of realizing the unio mentalis, of affecting its union with the body, thereby completing the second stage of the conjunctio. We would say that with this production of a physical equivalent, the idea of the self had taken shape. But the alchemist associated his work with something more potent and more original than our pale abstraction. He felt it as a magically effective action, which, like the substance itself, imparted magical qualities. Yeah, it is a magically effective action that is akin to moving water. The projection of magical qualities indicates the existence of corresponding effects on consciousness. That is to say, the adept felt a numinous effect emanating from the lapis, or whatever he called the arcane substance. We, with our rationalistic minds, would scarcely attribute any such thing to the pictures which the modern man makes of his intuitive vision of unconscious contents. But it depends on whether we are dealing with the conscious or with the unconscious. The unconscious does in fact seem to be influenced by these images. One comes to this conclusion when one examines more closely the psychic reactions of the patients to their own drawings. They do have in the end a quieting influence and create something like an inner foundation, while the adept had always looked for the effects of his stone outside, for instance as the panacea or golden tincture or life-prolonging elixir, and only during the 16th century pointed with unmistakable clarity to an inner effect. Psychological experience emphasizes, above all, the subjective reaction to the formulation of images, and, with a free and open mind, still reserves judgment in regard to the possible objective effects. Footnote 227. I refer here to the relation between the archetype and the phenomenon of synchronicity. And that is going to bring us to the end of Part 8. Hopefully I brought a little bit of enlightenment and not too much confusion to a somewhat difficult series of topics. I understand that I hold some unconventional beliefs, and I do have a tendency to step on toes when I relay those. It is not intentional, but it is not something that I apologize for. Once again, right, I don't have a whole lot to add here. I really thought that this was going to take longer. I kind of blew through it. I didn't stop in some of the places that I probably would have. But we have, right, if you needed more clarification for any of this, fall back to pretty much any of the previous videos. All of the points that could be misunderstood here, we have hit in almost every single video. And I really did think that this one was going to be a lot longer than it is. Right, we're at 113. That's not bad. I really thought we'd be closer to 145 even without the commentary. So if you like what I'm doing over here, let me know down below. Give me a like, a share, a follow. Throw me a comment whether you agree or disagree with anything that was stated. Put it in the box down below. And if it remains respectful, it gets to remain up. If you really like what I'm doing over here, hit me with that super thanks. Consider joining for a membership, picking up a copy of my book where I do talk about these things, or getting in contact with me directly or supporting the channel through the links provided down below. To the crew, thanks for hanging out. I appreciate every single minute that you are here with me, and I am praying for you every single day. Until next time, I love you. God loves you. You are perfect, whole, and complete just the way that you are. And this has been Pittstake. Peace.